Hello, tired listener. You could be asleep right now. You could be making tea. You could even be scrolling through your feed for the 1000th time, looking at recipes you'll never cook. But no, you're here, preparing to hear about the most absurd laws of the Middle Ages. Yes, laws. Those little things that today keep you from parking in a forbidden spot, but in the 13th century kept you from existing with dignity. Because while you complain about the bureaucracy at the DMV today, in the Middle Ages, people were being arrested for wearing clothes that were too nice. Yes, that was literally a crime. You heard that correctly. Luxury was considered a threat, almost as dangerous as sneezing near the wrong priest. But before we dive into this legal quagmire of medieval insanity, do this. Go ahead, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Because if you don't, YouTube will think this content is useless, and honestly, it's not that far off. So, my dear tired listener, subscribe. It's free, and it helps the channel. Now turn off the lights, take a deep breath, and let's slowly enter this wonderful universe where justice wore armor and thought old cheese was a spiritual cure. You wake up, rubbing your eyes, in a world where the crime isn't murder, theft, or fraud. It's wearing velvet. You get up and by a twist of fate decide to put on that tunic your aunt gave you, made of a minimally decent fabric. After all, it was just left over from a noble corpse. Done. You're an outlaw, a stylish criminal, but a criminal nonetheless. The village patrol stops you. They look you up and down like they're observing a walking scandal. The fabric is too beautiful for your social status. This is dangerous. If everyone started dressing well, who would know who's in charge? How would the elite identify who they could step on and who should be stepped on? And then you realize your freedom is trapped in a dress code. Literally. If your shirt looks too expensive, jail or a fine or public humiliation, or all three, because if you're going to suffer, it might as well be in public. You try to flee to the countryside where no one can see you, but there's no peace there either. Kissing someone on impulse, a terrible idea. In some regions, a kiss was a legal marriage contract. You kissed, you married, even if it was just to see if the person's breath was less rotten than the breakfast cheese. And no, you can't undo it. You'll have to live with the kiss and the trauma. But none of that matters right now because it's Wednesday. And in the village where you are, Wednesday is the official day for stale bread. Fresh bread is only on Friday. Because if the baker makes bread that's too soft, it creates unfair competition. Seriously, the bread might be tasty, but the law is tough. You bite into that piece of fermented brick with hope and spit out crumbs of frustration. You think about adopting a cat, a silent companion, useful against rats, maybe even cute. But then you remember, women with too many cats are suspicious. Especially if they live alone. 3 cats, witchcraft, a black cat, a confirmed pact with the devil. You're not even a woman, but you're starting to think you'll be accused anyway, just for thinking about the cat. You sit down, try to scratch your head without looking suspicious, because even that is regulated. Your hair is too long, or too braided, or has a suspicious shine depending on the village. This is excessive vanity, a crime punishable by penance, a fine, or the cut, and not a haircut, a judicial cut. And that's just the beginning. There are 40 laws, 40. One more useless than the other, but all real, recorded, applied. People were beaten for this, died for this, or worse, had to pay taxes on it. You take a deep breath, lying down, covered with a clean sheet, and without fear of being punished for using cotton, a modern privilege. To sleep without wondering if your pillow will be used as evidence in a witchcraft trial. Congratulations. Now, you're walking down the street, not doing anything wrong, just trying to exist. Basic stuff. But suddenly you let out a sneeze that's a little too loud, a little ill-timed, bad luck. A man with the face of a judge, crooked shoes, and a pointed finger appears from nowhere. He heard the sneeze. He noticed the lack of a "bless you." And now you are a suspect. Of what? Of something. There's always something. When in doubt, you're guilty. Because in the Middle Ages, any behavior off script could become grounds for a public trial and an existential crisis. You try to explain it was just pollen, that your medieval allergies are acting up, but people are already whispering that you've been acting strange, that you meddle with herbs, which, by the way, could mean anything from making tea to, well, making tea. The point is, in the world of medieval laws, suspicion is worth more than evidence, and a sneeze is practically a confession. You hide in an alley, but the alley has rules. Because the city has rules, and many of them were made by someone who clearly lost a bet with common sense, like the one that forbade dancing in the street. Dancing in the street, because it could invoke strange forces or cause emotional gatherings. True, in certain regions of Germany, especially after outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing, yes, that also happened, authorities banned any rhythmic demonstration outside of a church. No rattling your skeleton. And look, your skeleton is already a bit loose. Then you think, I'll just laugh to relieve the tension. No. Laughing too much could also be a problem. In some monasteries, there were codes of silence so severe that laughing during dinner could be considered grave disrespect. And depending on the mood of the abbot that day, you'd spend the rest of the week fasting, kneeling, and trying not to die of boredom. Fun was regulated and usually forbidden. You leave the alley, a bit hunched over, and decide to enter a tavern to pretend the world makes sense. Inside, stuffy air, the smell of people, suspicious drink fermenting in wooden buckets. Medieval paradise. But then, of course, there's another absurd law waiting for you. In various regions of Europe, it was forbidden to play dice, to gamble, to have fun wagering coins. Why? Because it corrupts the youth. You aren't young, but you aren't uncorrupted either. So you roll a die, hidden. And of course a guard materializes from the floorboards. He looks at you as if to say, you learned nothing from yesterday's bread, did you? And you answer with your eyes, no, I didn't. Because learning is impossible when the rules change based on the position of the moon and the local bishop's mood. You try to leave through the back door, but then you remember, in certain parts of Italy and France, even the gates of houses were regulated. Size, material, height, all controlled. If your door was too eye-catching, it could be a sign of vanity. And vanity, as you've already noticed, was the favorite crime of medieval legislators, which is ironic, considering most of them wore ridiculous hats with feathers that looked like depressed dusters. Tired of the city, you think, I'll go live in the country, far from these crazy laws. But then, reality hits. The countryside has worse rules. Like, for example, the one forbidding peasants from hunting rabbits. That's right. If a hungry rabbit appeared in your tiny garden and started chewing on your only turnip, you had to watch quietly. Because, surprise, the rabbit might be the property of the feudal lord. Literally. Trying to shoo the creature away with any extra energy could lead to an accusation of rabbit theft. Because, after all, even the wild animals had an owner. And it wasn't you. You're hungry, but you're also scared and your back hurts. And what do you get? Another bizarre law. Depending on the region, it was forbidden to bake bread in your own oven. All bread had to be baked in the village's collective oven, supervised by someone who probably hadn't washed their hands since the last plague. The reason? Taxes, of course. Baking your own bread was considered tax evasion, which honestly is the most medieval thing you'll hear today. Tired, hungry, and wearing clothes that have already earned you 3 fines and 2 side eyes, you sit on a rock and contemplate existence. The rock, by the way, might not be yours, because in the enchanted world of medieval legality, even where you could sit was regulated. There was a law that forbade resting in the square if you weren't a registered resident. That's right. You could only be tired on the ground if the ground was authorized. And then, of course, There's the rotten cherry on the unleavened cake, laws against being foreign. Depending on the village, if you showed up with a different accent, strange clothes, or hair that didn't follow the local model, you could be expelled, or accused of espionage, or of bringing diseases, or all of the above. The logic was, if you weren't born here, you are a problem. The Middle Ages were, let's say, very attached to the concept of us against everyone else. And you think about screaming, but you remember that screaming in some regions was considered public disorder. Even if it was just from pain or frustration, you could be fined for expressing emotion above the permitted volume. And if you were a woman, then the list of prohibitions doubled. The female voice in public was so frowned upon that many cities created rules about silent behavior. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, mandatory silence for reasons of gender. Because, of course, nothing is more medieval than regulating who can make a sound. You get up, dust yourself off, and try to move on. But your gait attracts attention. Seriously. In certain monasteries, there were rules even for your posture while walking. Shoulders low, head inclined, short steps. Anything else was a sign of pride. And pride was the direct path to confession, fasting, and sometimes the dungeon. By now, you get it. Living in the Middle Ages was like participating in a game with 40 levels, no instructions, and rules that change while you're playing. One mistake, you lose points. 2 mistakes, you lose your house. 3 mistakes, you lose your head. Metaphorically, or not. You lie down on the side of the road, exhausted, confused, and with the feeling that your simple existence is a potential crime. But it's okay. You haven't been arrested today, yet. You wake up again, or maybe you never even slept. It's hard to tell, because what's keeping you awake now isn't the sound of the neighbor's cart, nor the priest's snoring. It's the simple fact that if you step out of line, you could end up as the village's main event. Literally, with an audience shouting and, depending on your luck, stale bread flying at your face. You yawn, get up, breathe deep. You try to remember which idiotic law you broke yesterday. Was it the crooked hat? The crooked look? Or just existing? It doesn't matter. The answer is, you are a suspect, and in a legal system where evidence is just a vague, subjective concept, being a suspect is enough to start the show. You're dragged to the square. The entire village gathers as if they're about to watch the championship final of unjustified torture. There are even children eating raw rye on their grandmother's lap. The judge arrives. He has that look of someone who hasn't slept in 3 days and still thinks he rules everything. Spoiler, he does. The crime, chicken theft. Your defense, I only looked at the chicken. The sentence, we'll find out if you're telling the truth. The traditional way. Now comes the legal part, literally. Because yes, there were officially recognized methods as valid forms of investigation. Welcome to the system of the ordeal, where truth doesn't come from proof. It comes with blisters, burn blisters. You are informed that you will undergo the test of boiling water, a real method used in various parts of Europe between the 9th and 13th centuries. You have to plunge your hand into a bubbling cauldron to retrieve a stone from the bottom. If your hand heals without infection in 3 days, congratulations, you're innocent. If it gets infected, which it always does, you're guilty, and probably skinless. Detail: the people who evaluate whether it healed well are the same people who told you to stick your hand in the soup of suffering. Now, if the chicken disappeared in a classier village, maybe your test would be different. Maybe it's the cold water ordeal, another classic of logic-free justice. They tie you up with ropes and throw you in a lake. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty. The explanation: water rejects a sinful body. Physics and logic were dismissed from this courtroom. You take a deep breath and are thankful for a brief moment that you're only hearing this story and not living it. Because yes, All of this was real, documented, practiced. Medieval justice wasn't a scale. It was a game of Russian roulette with special effects. But you think, okay, what if the person is noble? Did they suffer too? Good question. The answer depends on the person's political utility. But yes, even royals could be judged, only the process was a bit more theatrical. Need an example? In 1324 in France, King Charles IV discovered his sisters-in-law were having suspicious friendships with knights of the court. What did he do? A trial, complete with forced confessions, public humiliation, and symbolic execution. The knights were brutally eliminated, and the women had to shave their heads and live imprisoned. All because of a poorly explained rumor, and because, well, the king didn't like gossip. While you digest that, or try to forget it, it's time to talk about the law of false bread. Remember the stale bread from last week? Well, if a baker was caught selling bread that weighed less than declared, he could be punished with public shame. In London, for example, in the 13th century, the deceitful baker was tied to a plank and dunked in a dirty river. That's right, the famous duck the liar, because light bread was a serious crime. More serious than, say, cutting down a tree without permission. And the worst part, the public thought it was funny. There was laughter, there were bets, a mix of justice and entertainment, like a reality show that smelled of sewage. You try to process all this and walk slowly toward the tavern. Inside, a conversation catches your attention. They're talking about the cut-tongue law. In some medieval cities, if you were caught lying or even just gossiping too much, you could be sentenced to have your tongue, let's say, edited, in public. The scene involved a hammer, iron, and the hope of never having to sing again. The justification? To preserve order, but in practice it was just another way to silence anyone who was annoying. And gossip, by the way, could be anything. From complaining about the price of corn to saying the priest looked too tired to be that holy. You shrink into a corner, thinking about staying quiet, but then you remember the story of the scold's bridle, a real iron device with a bit that went into the mouth of the person who talked too much, used primarily on women. Just the thought of rusty metal hitting teeth makes you start praying for a life of voluntary silence. And it wasn't just gossip that got you jailed. In certain regions, saying the king's name without his title was a crime. Yes, if you called the king Henry and not his most royal majesty of the heavens and visible lands, problem. A fine, a lashing, or, depending on the king, a farewell note from your own head. You reach an inevitable conclusion. Medieval crime wasn't about what you did. It was about what others thought you were doing. And worse, the judgment came before the question. You wonder, but didn't anyone find this absurd? Yes, many people did. But saying so out loud was dangerous. So the people watched, suffered, laughed, and went home with the feeling that with any luck, the next person in line wouldn't be them. You settle into your modern bed, the one with a pillow, a clean sheet, and no judgment for thinking too loud. And before you close your eyes, you ask yourself again, how did people survive so long with so many bad laws? Spoiler, many didn't. The night passes slowly, scratched by itches that come from nowhere and go nowhere. You don't even know if you slept or just passed out from exhaustion. Your body complains, your skin itches, and the pillow, if you can even call that pile of compacted straw a pillow, stinks of ancestral sweat and bad decisions. The itch doesn't stop. One behind your ear, another on your foot, another that seems to have come from the last century. It probably has a life of its own. You toss, trying to find a clean spot on the mattress that has, honestly, become an ecosystem. You haven't even gotten up, but your body has already been warned. There will be no bath today either. Besides, bathing is a modern concept. Here in the Middle Ages, bathing is a controversial issue, not because there's no soap, that doesn't exist yet, but because washing the body was considered dangerous. That's right. It was believed that water opened the pores, and through them, bad air entered, causing disease, the evil eye, and unnecessary philosophical reflections. So you spend another day accumulating layers of sweat, dirt, and history. It's as if your body is becoming a fossil in real time. You finally stand up. You put your foot on the floor and feel something between dried mud, ancestral dust, and emotional humidity. The floor of your house is packed earth, but not packed by carpenters, it's packed by life. Every single particle, living or dead, that has passed through here has left a bit of itself, including you. You walk to the basin of stagnant water that you swear is for washing your face. Something moves inside it. Could be a mosquito, could be an ancestor, impossible to tell. You wet your hands and pass them over your face. A symbolic gesture. The dirt just moves to a new location. And if you're feeling inspired, you might even chew on a sprig of rosemary to clean your mouth. Brushing your teeth. That's science fiction. But let's talk about that. Teeth. That part of the body that should shine and chew. Here they do the opposite. Your medieval smile looks like an abandoned battlefield. Because guess what? No brush, no paste, no floss. The closest you get to oral hygiene is chewing on twigs and praying there are no bugs inside. And if you feel a pain way back in your gum, where a tooth disappeared long ago, you just have to hope it doesn't swell. Because if it swells, the most common remedy is to pray. And if that doesn't work, plan B, extraction by force, with a cold piece of iron and a hope for survival. Who does this? Usually the barber. Yes, the same guy who cuts hair and gives shaves, also pulls teeth, lances abscesses and stitches open wounds. Multi-purpose, like any desperate professional, you decide to leave the house. The smell inside is already confusing you, but outside, hope dies again. You remember that the streets are basically streams of things that came out of someone, or some animal. Most medieval cities had no sewage system. The solution, open the window and throw it, literally, complete with a warning shout, "Gardy-loo," which is a sort of, "heads up, I'm dumping." You step carefully, but it's no use. At some point, the thin, hole-ridden leather shoe you've worn for 8 years absorbs something you'd rather not investigate. If you're very lucky, maybe you can wash it in a stream. But remember, the same stream is used for drinking, washing clothes, dumping waste, and, if you're not careful, hiding some village secret. You try to ignore the odors, but it's difficult because everyone smells. Not out of shamelessness, but because it was the norm. And what's more, using perfume was also problematic. Depending on the time and place, strong scents could be considered indecent. So you live in a world where stench is the standard, and any attempt to improve it becomes suspicious. Then you remember maybe you can take a collective bath. There were public bathhouses in some cities, a Roman heritage, except they lost prestige over the centuries because the church began to see that pile of naked people in the steam as a kind of sensory temptation. Result, many bathhouses were closed, and those who continued to use them were viewed with a certain silent judgment. And even when they were open, the collective bath was more a social event than a cleaning ritual. Imagine sitting in a wooden tub surrounded by other equally filthy bodies with lukewarm, recycled water passed from one bucket to the next. Yes, recycled. You got in line, waited your turn, and when you got in, you just hoped the last person hadn't left a piece of themselves floating there. If you lived in the country, then forget it. Bathing was a big city thing. You used what you had, a cloth, a bucket, and a courage that only survival can explain. Ah, and soap. It existed, but it was a soap made from animal fat and wood ash. About as gentle on the skin as sand in the eye. Now, speaking of skin, you scratch. You scratch again. You scratch until you bleed, because your skin is infested. Fleas, lice, bed bugs. The true trinity of the Middle Ages. They were everywhere. In the beds, in the clothes, in the walls, and of course, on your scalp. Lace were so common they didn't even cause alarm. It was like, ah, you have them too? Great, we're itch brothers. In fact, the rich used fine-toothed combs not to style their hair, but to hunt lice with dignity. A social pastime, almost therapeutic. Now you ask, but what about the doctors? Well, they existed, a few, but the dominant theory was that of the four humours of the body. If you had a headache, it could be an excess of black bile. Yes, they loved a liquid metaphor. The solution? Reduce this internal excess with techniques that involved creative cuts or diets based on wine, vinegar, and courage. It was like a detox, only without the glamour, without the spa, and with a high risk of fainting. If the situation got really ugly, fever, infection, or a wound with a mind of its own, you were taken to someone more alternative, a mix of healer, faith leader, and botanist without a diploma. Herbs, compresses, leeches, prayers, and one or two panicked screams. All while you beg for a little relief and pray you don't become a tragic story at the next mass. You go back home, walk through the same mud as always, go inside, and lie down. But you know your mattress, or rather your pile of straw, is alive. Yes, literally. It breathes, it rustles, and it hosts an entire community of mites and other nocturnal colleagues. You try to sleep, but the itch pulls you back. The smell pulls you back. The Middle Ages pulls you back, and you accept it. Because here in the Middle Ages, hygiene is just a concept, a rumor, an urban legend. You close your eyes, try to ignore the sound of the rat passing by, and think only one thing. At least today, nobody threw boiling water on me by mistake. The sun hasn't even properly risen, and there's already a murmur in the village. You leave the house trying to pretend everything is fine, that the itch has subsided, that the smell isn't yours. But the world outside is calling. And it's not a friendly call. It's more like an involuntary summons to the most feared thing in the Middle Ages, coexistence. Because living in fear of the plague, the baker, and your own bed is already complicated. Now, add a bunch of suspicious people, absurd laws, and public square gossip. There you have it, the complete package of medieval social torture. You walk to the market looking for a slightly wilted turnip to call lunch. But when you get there, you feel the stares. Yes, they're staring at you. Because in medieval towns, everything was grounds for judgment. The way you walk, your sweaty tunic, even the number of times you scratch your nose. And people are unforgiving. Gossip travels faster than a royal messenger. And if you're a woman, the list of judgments doubles. Because then the problem is laughing too loud, walking alone, walking with someone, looking at someone, not looking at someone, owning a cat, owning two cats. Having the face of someone who once thought about owning a cat. And speaking of cats, you remember the neighbor down the street, the one who had 4 cats, an expression of someone who'd seen too much, and a garden full of rue? Guess what? She's gone. They said she was invited to provide clarification. If she'll be back, nobody knows. But her cat showed up yesterday alone, with the look of someone who witnessed a meeting with the beyond, and survived. Because yes, the witch hunts weren't an urban legend. They were an official agenda in various parts of Europe, especially at the end of the Middle Ages, between the 15th and 17th centuries. But the paranoia came from before. Any abnormal behavior could be associated with mystical evil forces, curing a stomachache with herbal tea, witchcraft, talking to yourself, witchcraft, knowing how to read, witchcraft, with a bonus and double penalty. And then you think, but what if I just stay really quiet, just listening? That doesn't work either. In many villages, too much silence also generated suspicion. If you didn't talk to anyone, you were weird. If you talked to everyone, you were a gossip. If you talked to some and not others, you were plotting. In other words, living in society was like walking through a minefield. In torn sandals, you keep walking and hear a noise. There's an argument in front of the church. 2 men, 3 opinions. half a dozen poorly articulated sentences, and a lot of spitting. They're fighting because one of them crossed the other's path without making the sign of the cross. This, believe it or not, could cause a real problem. In times when every misfortune was seen as divine punishment, just passing someone by could be interpreted as a curse, a lack of faith, or a social affront. And the fights didn't stop there. In some Italian cities, for example, there were laws punishing excessive emotion in public. Yes, yelling, gesturing too much, or showing anger could be interpreted as disturbing the peace, leading to fines, whippings, or days in jail. You try to circle the crowd, but it's too late. A pot-bellied man, smelling of garlic and resentment, accuses you of looking sideways at his wife. You didn't even see the woman, but at this point, denying it just confirms it. The crowd grows, the shouting increases, and luckily, a priest arrives. He calms things down with a generic blessing and a "not today, Satan" look. You escape, but with a new reputation, the one who looks sideways at other men's wives. You decide to turn around and go home, but on the way, you see a group forming around a bard, an itinerant artist. He's playing something that sounds like a cross between a lament and a rhythmic sob. Medieval music, and the people love it. But be careful. In many cities, public performances required authorization. Without it, the bard could be arrested for influencing the masses without permission. You remember that in 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt in England, artists who recited verses with social criticism were hunted. Because you see, laughter and rhyme could topple empires, literally. So, if you wanted to tell a joke, you'd better tell it in the kitchen, preferably in a whisper, and with trustworthy witnesses. And if you think at least the parties were free, think again. Some villages prohibited wedding feasts that went past a certain hour. If people made noise after the curfew, the punishment could range from a fine to the confiscation of the musical instruments. And nobody messes with the groom's lute and gets away with it. You get home, tired, and notice your door has a notice on it. The local magistrate wants to see you. You tremble. You try to think if you forgot to pay some tax. But no. The reason is something else. Someone saw you talking to a French merchant, and as you know, talking to foreigners in certain eras was viewed with extreme suspicion, especially during outbreaks of plague or local wars. And worse, depending on the city, foreigners had to wear differentiated clothing or visual symbols to identify their origin. Some were forbidden from circulating at certain hours or frequenting certain public spaces. You go to the magistrate. He looks at you with that air of someone who has already condemned people for sneezing, but surprisingly, he just asks, "Did that Frenchman offer you any cheese?" You hesitate. He jots something down on a piece of parchment and sends you away. Maybe now, in addition to being the one who looks sideways at other men's wives, you're also the one who gets involved with international cheese. Medieval social life wasn't made of balls, serenades, and poetry. It was made of judgments, side-eyes, and laws that turned any bump into a threat to public order. You lived in a constant theater, where any step out of choreography could become the final scene. You get home, lock the door, pull the hole-ridden cloth curtain, and sit on the wooden bench that creaks with every thought. You breathe deeply and think, if you need permission even to smile, maybe silence is the only freedom I have left. But not for long, because tomorrow is market day. And there, the turnip you picked up today might be the reason for your next accusation. You're still sitting on your wooden bench, thinking about the market, the suspicious cheese, and your new reputation as a dangerous connoisseur of international conversations, when you hear a knock. A neighbor appears. She's here to announce that the daughter of the blacksmith's cousin's godmother is getting married, and you're invited. Well, sort of. Because in the Middle Ages, an invitation wasn't really a come if you want. It was more of a, if you don't come, I'll be suspicious. You put on your best tunic, which is to say, the least torn one, the one that still only holds onto its smell for a few hours. and you head to the ceremony. On the way, you think about how love works in this era. Spoiler, it doesn't. Because the concept of marrying for love is still in the science fiction department. Marriage here is a contract. An agreement between families, between lands, between possessions, sometimes between people who don't even know each other. And medieval romanticism is about as present as soap. In other words, absent. You arrive at the location. The bride looks like she's been crying for 12 hours straight. The groom looks like someone who still doesn't understand what's happening. The priest says beautiful words, but everyone knows the most anticipated part is the end, when the wine and stale bread are released. And then you remember, even to get married, there were absurd laws, like one that existed in some regions of France, where the feudal lord had the right to bless the servant's marriage in person. Fortunately, this became more legend and folklore than common practice, but the fear existed. And the very fact that someone cogitated this law shows that the medieval sense of boundaries was, let's say, elastic. Another bizarre one. There were specific rules for kissing in public. In certain Italian cities, kissing without authorization or in sacred places could be punished with a fine. Kissing in the wrong place was considered a religious affront or indecency. A silly affection could cost you your lunch for the week. During the party, you hear a murmur. They're commenting that the couple almost couldn't get married. The reason? One of them was a fourth cousin, and in many parts of Europe, that was forbidden by the church. The problem is, in small villages, everyone was someone's cousin. Marrying without some minimal consanguinity was almost impossible, so marriages were authorized, with a workaround, with the payment of indulgences or ecclesiastical favors. Yes, even love had to pay a toll. And if you thought you'd escape by being single, think again. In some regions, single men were taxed. Extra taxes. The logic, if you're not contributing heirs to the feudal lord, then contribute money. The bachelor tax. Almost as depressing as the social life at the market. And it doesn't stop there. Imagine you're already married. Wonderful. Now you want to leave the village with your spouse, travel, see the world? Wrong. In many fiefdoms, peasants couldn't get married without the lord's authorization, nor could they move. It was an almost contractual bond. Marrying someone from another fiefdom, then, could generate a legal dispute between lords, as if you were a chess piece with optional feelings. You try to absorb all this while chewing a piece of bread that has clearly survived 3 previous weddings. The wine tastes sour, with a hint of "it was this" or the well water. And the mood starts to get tense when someone comments that the couple didn't perform the full public rite. Yes, because there were regions where the marriage was only validated if the couple presented themselves publicly as husband and wife. It was like mandatory theatre. This is my husband. This is my wife. Without it, the union could be contested. And if someone was seen leaving the other's house before the announcement, scandal. The whole village would stop to give their opinion. You finish the bread with difficulty and try to leave without seeming rude. But then the blacksmith, already a bit altered, starts singing a popular song. So far, normal. Except, the lyrics make fun of the local bishop. Done. Party's over. Because in various cities, it was forbidden to satirize church authorities, even if it was a wedding song, even if nobody understood the whole lyric. You go back home with another lesson learned. Love here is serious business. Audited, documented, and whenever possible, taxed. Marriage wasn't a celebration of passion, but a public proof that you fit into the social puzzle. A puzzle with crooked pieces, sharp edges, and rules that change with the priest's mood. On the way, you see a young couple talking behind the mill. They're laughing, exchanging sweet words. You smile and hope no one sees them, because at this point, even hope could be considered a crime. You get home, lock the door, lean against the wall and breathe. In the Middle Ages, even love was policed, romance was timed, and the kiss Well, better to keep it hidden, because any sign of affection off script could take you from the altar straight to the tribunal, with or without witnesses. Are you tired of trying to understand how things work around here? Today, you decide to conduct a social experiment with what you've got. You take that least grimy tunic, the one that only looks like it's been used by 3 generations, and decide to go further. You pass a damp cloth over your face, comb your hair with your fingers, and even pick some burrs off the hem. You're not clean, but you're passable. And that's the problem, because when you hit the street, people look at you as if you just walked out of a palace. A citizen with fewer crusts of dirt than usual, dangerous, weird, possibly a sorcerer. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, appearance wasn't just aesthetics, it was social identity, and any attempt to deviate from the standard look could generate suspicion, reprimand, or fines. Yes, there was a fine for looking rich without being rich. In various cities, there were sumptuary laws that defined what each social class could or could not wear. A real example, in 14th century Florence, a peasant who showed up in silk clothes could be punished, because silk was reserved for nobility or very wealthy merchants. Fabric wasn't just fabric, it was a stitched-on social security card. You remember this, and you run back home, change tunics and put the original version back on, sweaty, yellowed, and smelling of a difficult life. Ah, yes. Now you're invisible again. What a relief. But you still notice something different about some people in the village. Some wear exaggerated hats with feathers or vibrant colors. Others, pointy shoes. Very pointy, like dangerously pointy. You think it's fashion? No, it was a sign of status. The pointy shoes, called poulaines or krakows, were symbols of wealth and arrogance. And of course they were banned in various regions for being too vain. Yes, there was a time when the point of your shoe was a legislative matter. Because, when in doubt, the Middle Ages preferred to control footwear rather than solve sanitation problems. You try to ignore all this. You go to the market to find something edible, or at least chewable. And then you see a young man wearing a braided leather belt, seemingly common, but the old woman next to him crosses herself. The reason? The color of the belt. In some regions, colors also had rules. Dark blue, for example, was associated with nobility. Purple, only for high-ranking clergy. Wearing the wrong color was, at minimum, pretension. And pretension was practically a social sin. You walk among the stalls, half in shock, half used to it. You've seen so much absurdity that your brain is starting to accept it. It's like hearing someone say the wind is made of demons. You don't believe it, but you don't not believe it either. And in the midst of this daze, you trip on a stone. Literally, because the street isn't paved, just dried mud and the occasional chicken bone. You almost fall, but you recover with a pirouette worthy of someone who doesn't want to attract attention. The old woman who crossed herself now looks at you with pity. "He's got the tapping spirit," she mutters. And look, since you've made it this far, let me tell you something. If you're finding all this to be historical nonsense, and you're even minimally amused by the level of medieval madness, do a favor for this poor narrator who doesn't even have a peacock feather to put in his hat. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, because if not even the Middle Ages escaped public vigilance, imagine this content trying to survive the YouTube algorithm. Honestly, the algorithm is more critical than a priest at communion. So, help out, before they put me to the torch for telling these uncomfortable truths. But back to the drama. You pass a tavern and see a man with a kind of medallion hanging from his neck. From a distance it looks nice, but up close it's made of wood, an attempt to imitate a noble item. He's stopped by a local guard who accuses him of wearing insignia without permission. Because yes, even the use of accessories was regulated. Trying to look like a knight without being one was seen as identity fraud and brought severe punishment. Another real example. In certain fiefdoms, no one could wear decorative swords or gilded brooches without the local lord's permission, because that could confuse the populace, and confusion was a crime. You couldn't even resemble someone important. And speaking of confusion, the biggest one of all was the judgment of hair. That's right, hair. You thought your disheveled look was just a lack of shampoo, but in the Middle Ages, it was observed with almost religious attention. In various religious orders and regions, hair length was a sign of faith, position, or even subversion. Monks had to shave the tops of their heads, the famous tonsure, as a sign of humility. Overly long hair on men could be frowned upon. For women, loose hair was associated with sin. The solution: veils, mantillas, or, in the case of the most paranoid, a dishcloth strategically tied to the forehead. You remember a case told in the village. A woman was fined for going out with her hair braided in an extravagant way. Apparently, elaborate braids signaled excessive vanity, which was practically an invitation to ecclesiastical punishment. Not even braids escaped. You, just in case, pull a generic brown cap onto your head. Better to look like a tired baker than a stylish heretic. The sun begins to set. You walk back home, reflecting that getting dressed in the Middle Ages was a daily test. A balance between looking poor enough not to generate envy and clean enough not to attract plagues. The biological ones and the spiritual ones. You throw yourself onto your improvised bed, already resigned, because here, even dressing wrong can get you sent to court. And tomorrow maybe they'll invent a new forbidden color. You try to sleep, but a scream echoes through the village. At this point, nothing surprises you. You just think, is that punishment or a party? And honestly, it could be both. In the Middle Ages, the lines between a public event and judicial punishment were flexible. When in doubt, the people gathered, with bread, with wine, with anxiety. The next morning, you wake up or perhaps resuscitate after another night of itching and existential reflection, and you discover the scream was from a guy who was arrested for stealing a loaf of bread. So far you think theft is wrong, right? But then comes the detail. The bread was spoiled, and the guy only took it because it was in the trash. Congratulations, medieval justice, punishing someone for stealing garbage. That's right, because in many villages, property was sacred, even when the item was already unusable. Stealing a stale loaf was almost the same as invading the feudal lord's castle and running off with his horse. In theory, at least. You decide to go to the square to see the trial. I mean the show, because justice here isn't done behind the scenes, it's open-air theatre. There's a bench for the accused, a chair for the local magistrate, usually a pot-bellied man who looks like he's never read a parchment, and a crowd ready to boo or applaud, depending on the day's excitement. And then you witness the marvel that is the medieval legal system. The trial begins with generic accusations: moral imbalance, suspicious intent, a crooked look. The defense, it doesn't exist. The accused barely knows how to speak, and even if he did, it wouldn't change anything. Because here, people's fates are decided by a combination of gossip, superstition, and a thirst for entertainment. And don't think it was just theft that got you in trouble. There were laws against everything, literally. In some cities, you could be punished for whistling too loudly, for singing an indecent song, for letting your pig run loose in the street. Yes, a fine for the rebellious pig. Even for sleeping too much, there was an official reprimand. And if you think the punishments were just fines or warnings, well, sit down. Depending on the village and the type of crime, or its imagined severity, punishments ranged from public exposure to creative methods of collective embarrassment. A real example, the pillory, a wooden frame where your head and arms were locked for hours or days in the public square for everyone to laugh, curse, or throw. Expired vegetables, a true forced stand-up routine. Another classic, the cucking stool, Used mainly for women accused of having a loose tongue, i.e. talking too much. The punishment was simple. She was placed on a high stool with a sign hanging around her neck, exhibited as a bad example. Because, of course, conversation was dangerous. What if she spread ideas? And if the case was more serious, like an accusation of witchcraft, disrespect to the clergy, or some nonsense invented last week, then more persuasive methods were used. One of them was the trial by water, totally scientific. It worked like this. The accused was thrown into a river or tank. If they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty. Yes, you understood that. Innocent, drowned. Guilty, wet and condemned. Genius. And don't think this was rare. Documented cases in Central and Eastern Europe show hundreds of trials based on this type of proof. It was the legal system, Russian roulette style, with fewer bullets and more buckets. You think about how you would be judged today. The list is long. You've already looked sideways at the shoemaker, talked to a Frenchman, worn a clean tunic, took too many turnips at the market, and laughed at a suspicious song. 5 reasons for, at minimum, 1 shift on the stool of shame. And if you were someone with land, i.e. more visible, then the punishments could include confiscation of property, temporary exile, or even educational humiliations. In some Germanic regions, for example, offenders could be forced to walk through the village wearing ridiculous hats or with bells hanging, alerting everyone to their infamy. But the crowd favorite was symbolic collective punishment, like making the person kneel and beg for forgiveness in public with false tears and the populace shouting "repent" as if it were a reality show. Who needed television when justice was so performative? You try to leave, but then the judge announces, "Today we will have a food-based punishment." A vendor was accused of selling expired fish. The penalty? To eat his own stock. In front of everyone, accompanied by prayers and laughter, the man accepts with a sigh. It's better than the water test. And if you think all this was improvised, you're wrong. There were legal manuals, yes. Like the Sachsenspiegel in Germany or the Siete Partidas in Spain. Entire books describing crimes and punishments, but the interpretation was free. Each village applied the law as it wished. The judge and priest were half lawyers, half artists. You go back home reflecting, not that you have a choice. Here any movement can be a crime. Thought too much? Heretic? Stayed silent? Subversive? Sneezed in the wrong direction? That gets complicated. You lie down on your pile of straw, close your eyes and think, with any luck, nobody will remember I took 2 turnips yesterday. Because in the Middle Ages, justice never slept. And when it did, it dreamed of new ways to punish people who just wanted to chew in peace. The day dawns. Maybe you slept, or maybe you just lay there thinking about the last public punishment that has fled your memory. But it doesn't matter. The market reopens. And with it, the spectacle of everything that was forbidden, and everything that wasn't, but should have been. You arrive at the market and smell something sweet, almost offensive to your medieval sensibilities. It's honey, real honey, which was extremely rare and considered almost medicinal. Because of this, in some cities, honey had a fixed price and was taxed, since it could sweeten even the patience of the grumpiest priest. And anyone who sold honey without documentation risked being accused of being a sweetness smuggler. Imagine being arrested for selling liquid happiness. You move away from the most fragrant stalls and head toward the cheeses. Here you find something more serious, literally cheeses. But there were places where cheese made with raw milk had strict rules because it could cause collective intestinal agitation or a threat to public morals. So only certain aged cheeses were allowed and the rest were taxed as dangerous cuisine. You grab a suspicious piece. The trembling vendor whispers that it's goat's milk. You tremble too, but you buy it. After all, hunger is about courage, not smell. While you chew, you overhear an invitation to the public bath. Your first reaction is to laugh bitterly. Because, as you know, Public baths were viewed with suspicion by the church and authorities, who thought they were hotbeds of sensuality or disease. So many of them were closed or regulated with so much bureaucracy that only 1 or 2 places remained. If you're lucky and you pay the entry fee, you look at the stagnant water and decide the bath will have to wait, and along with it, your modern dignity, which wasn't much to begin with. As you walk slowly back, you encounter a man dragging a barrel of beer. You even feel jealous, but then you remember some cities forbade the production of alcoholic beverages unsupervised by the monks. Homebrewing was viewed with such disdain that it could earn you a day of penance and 5 of moral hangover. And then, my friend, it was over. You continue on your way and trip over a loose board. You fall flat on your face with a sound that attracts curious glances. And the idiot watching says aloud, "You must have a retarded child." You roll your eyes, but everyone stops laughing, because insulting someone with a disability was considered a sin as grave as cheating at the market. Medieval law, when it worked, even had limits on humor. Impressive, right? You get up with dignity. Still a little dizzy, you notice an announcement nailed to the square's post. Laughter in temples is forbidden. If you remember correctly, whether in England or France, there was a belief that laughter in the house of God was a profane distraction. So, laughing during Mass could earn you days of compulsory prayer and a fine for the parish. You feel a slight urge to laugh nervously, but you prefer to save it for later. Maybe pirate a laugh in the comfort of your bed. On the way home, you cross paths with a woman selling dried flowers. She offers you a rose. You reply, "I'll only accept if it's not aromatic contraband." The joke goes unnoticed. Flower sellers were sometimes accused of witchcraft because of the perfume. Vegetal perfume was almost magical and definitely regulated. You continue on, feeling the weight of every scent, every curve of the street, as if you were walking on a game board of invisible accusations. You get home, lock the door, and pull the curtain. Outside, the world continues to conspire with fragrances, dangerous cheeses, and rules about hygiene. You sigh. Your body stinks, your stomach complains, and the world smells of regulation. But at least for today, you are still free enough to chew suspicious cheese and laugh at yourself, discreetly in the dark. And you know that tomorrow the market is back. New rules, new aromas. And you, well, you'll keep breathing. And whenever possible, defying the norms with a piece of clandestine cheese, you're there in the dark of your straw den, reflecting on how you survived one more day without being arrested for chewing, laughing, or breathing outside the ecclesiastical standard. The clandestine cheese has already had a side effect, philosophical thoughts. You almost fall asleep, almost. But then you hear a sound outside, not people, a bark. A single, hoarse, offended, almost indignant bark. And you recognize the timbre. It's the neighbor's dog, the one that growls even at its own shadow. It probably escaped its rope and is now out there, threatening the 10 p.m. peace and ruining the whole street's reputation. You get up, pushing the wooden door with effort and 2 cracks from your lower back, and you peek out. Not that you want to help, you just want to know if you're going to get blamed. Because in this era, if the neighbor's dog attacked someone, it was possible you'd be called to account, simply for being there. Eyewitness, potential accomplice. Who told you to have eyes? There it is, the animal, dirty, hungry, and visibly angry at life. Behind it comes the village guard, huffing, because here animals also had to obey laws, and if you thought only people could be accused of crimes, surprise, dogs could be. So could pigs. There are even records of pigs being put on trial for causing accidents, with a judge, witnesses, and everything. The Middle Ages, where not even the bacon escapes bureaucracy. The dog disappears into an alley, but the guard sees you standing there and decides to do what every mediocre inspector loves to do. Bother the person who's being quiet. He asks why you're just standing there, looking at a piece of bread. You say it's existential reflection. He doesn't understand, but he makes a note. At some point, this will become an accusation. You keep walking and cross paths with two men arguing. The reason? One of them tried to sell a knife with a carved handle. The other party found the carving too decorative for a commoner. And here's the bizarre detail. In certain periods and regions, the use of overly adorned items by common people was forbidden, because the ornament was considered a symbol of luxury. And luxury, of course, was exclusive to the important people, also known as the ones who never bathed but had crowns. You decide to change direction and head toward the center, where a cart is being stopped by a bridge inspector. Yes, that's right, a bridge inspector. The man measures the weight of the cart with a rope and a critical eye. He accuses the driver of transporting an excess of hay. You laugh internally, which is dangerous, because you remember that in some cities there was an official limit on hay per cart. Exceeding it could damage the bridge, or worse, become a symbol of rural opulence. And that was not allowed. The cart is released with a warning. The resigned driver promises that next time he'll bring less dried grass. You continue on your way, but at this point, you're starting to wonder if breathing too much is also taxed. On the way, you pass a school. And then you remember, education in the Middle Ages was a privilege, but not exactly a good privilege. If you knew how to read and weren't a priest, you were already weird. In many places, knowing too much could generate suspicion. After all, knowledge was seen as a dangerous weapon, especially if you didn't wear robes. Some regions of Europe enforced laws that limited access to books or defined that certain texts could only be read in Latin. The problem? The people didn't speak Latin. In other words, information was literally encoded to remain inaccessible. You want to learn wrong, or pay for it. You keep walking and see a group of children playing, throwing stones into a bucket. At first, it seems harmless, but a priest passes by, observes the scene, and decides to intervene. He declares that this is a game of pagan origin, and done, game forbidden. Because yes, even children's games could be regulated. Games that involved luck, dice, or running too much, depending on the era, could be considered inappropriate, partly because they distracted from catechism, and partly because the noise bothered the more sensitive members of the elite. You turn around and head toward the mill. Just seeing children being reprimanded for having fun makes you feel like you need air. But when you arrive, you see a notice affixed to a stake. Forbidden to walk at night without an authorized lantern. Yes. Even the lanterns were regulated, because you see, light represented power, and walking at night without a valid reason could be interpreted as the behavior of someone who was trying to do something they shouldn't. You hurry back to your house, you arrive, close the door and throw yourself onto the least hard corner of the floor, and then you realize something. The Middle Ages wasn't just a set of sanitary, economic and religious problems. It was a machine for creating absurd rules to control even the most useless details of your existence. You couldn't have a loose dog, or a pretty knife, or excess hay, or an improvised lantern. And of course, you couldn't have too much knowledge, too much appearance, or too much joy. The objective was simple. Be mediocre, obedient, and if possible, almost invisible. And even then, you were still at risk. You take a deep breath. Not because you're going to sleep, after all, you can't sleep with this level of regulation, but because it's one of the few actions that doesn't cost a tax. Yet. You're still trying to digest the episode with the dog and the lantern when you realize that somehow your stomach has also reacted. The suspicious cheese reigns supreme. But it's not just that. The sound of a drip wakes you. It doesn't matter if you were already asleep. This drip has the rhythm of torment and the impact of a savage reality. It seems even the house is fighting me, you think. And considering the medieval situation, that might even be true. Houses were too alive to be just things made of wood. The bigger problem, you know that if someone comes to you with a strange fever, you're going to be the neighborhood's informal health consultant. Because yes, medicine here was like a social network of advice, but with more superstition and no like button. And you've already heard that the baker in the square has strange spots on his skin, which, according to the curate, are signs of spiritual pendency. Translated, it could be disease, or it could be the universe wanting to remind you that dirt doesn't just disappear with a bath. You grumble and get up. You walk there slowly, of course, because your knees already complain just thinking about movement. You arrive at the baker's door, and the person who answers is a woman who looks like she's seen too many winters and tragedies. Her gaze is a kind of "open with caution, please." You enter and notice the place stinks of cloves, garlic, and failed hope. The baker is there, sitting, scratching his arm, which looks like it's been stamped by angry ants. Some neighbors are already around, murmuring diagnoses worthy of religious zeal. Everyone has an opinion, except the person who actually studied medicine, because whoever studied medicine for real was part of a university, writing in Latin, and very inaccessible. But not you. You have to improvise. So you try to help. You ask what he ate that was different. The answer: I chewed on some day-old cilantro. Bingo. In the mindset of that time, cilantro could aggravate a bilious humor or agitate the blood in excess, which was one of the most common explanations for any strange symptoms. The solution: an herbal compress, a light fast, and prayer. And when all else fails, plan B, bloodletting. Bloodletting is a fancy term, but think about it. It's basically cutting and draining your blood to balance the body's humors. In many places the barber did this, because he knew how to cut hair, pull teeth, bleed you, and maybe sing distractedly. You imagine bloodletting sounded like a medieval spa, until you learn that it almost always left the person weaker, anemic, and wanting to request eternal vacation. You try to change the subject, suggesting warm broth and rest, but someone mentions the local bulletin. Yes, there were bulletins, collected in monasteries, with miraculous recipes, and a pigeon appears with a parchment of instructions. Not literally a pigeon, but close. Remedies based on components like ocelot fat or chimney ash are suggested. It sounds improbable today, but it was common. The entire medieval pharmacy carried more notions of spirituality and strange geography than known chemistry. You, out of a survivor's instinct, decide to return to your straw den. The neighbors already seem calmer, or maybe just too tired to smell the baker. And you wonder, how did someone get the idea to connect cilantro with blood? The answer is simple. In the Middle Ages, diagnosis was divination based on ancient traditions. You get home, close the door carefully, and take a deep breath. The smell of dried herbs envelops you. You try to incorporate this as the perfume of survival and feel a mix of relief and pity for the baker. But you know that even here, health was a privilege. If you were rich, you had access to nascent medicine, expensive books, remedies only the clergy could bless. If you were a peasant like you depended on healers, herbs, and the advice of a man who hadn't washed his razor since the last bloodletting. You lie down on the straw again, still with the sound of the drip, singing a moment of conflict. You close your eyes and think, the only thing I can trust is the flu algorithm that will attack me by surprise tomorrow. Because in the Middle Ages, even disease had a law. If you didn't declare yourself sick, you were a bum. If you did declare, you were improvident. And if you got better, the priest wanted credit. You smile ironically and give in to sleep. With or without the drip, you're there in the dry heat of your medieval den, a pile of straw with a holy blanket, already thinking about how this day of improvised consultations, suspicious cilantro, and smells that made your nose want to flee has gone. Silence is rare here. Even in the dark, there's always a subtle noise. Wood creaking, wind that seems to whisper conspiracies, Or maybe a large rat rehearsing its off-key dance steps. Now you hear a rumor of metal right in the center of the street. You think it's just another cart passing, but no, it's the sound of weapons being cleaned, sharpened, or displayed. In many villages, blacksmiths had to keep records of the number of blades produced because swords were subject to taxes and manufacturing controls. It was a crime to make too many swords or to make them without authorization. And if a new weapon appeared in the village, it could be grounds for investigation, maybe even confiscation. And that's not all. In certain places, men needed to register knife sharpeners or even wood chisels. If you had one, they'd come after you to control the quantity of pointy objects within a 15-league radius. Why? Because law and public safety were controlled down to the smallest details, including domestic cutting materials. You breathe in deeply and realize the neighbors are listening to the sound, a presence of power. So, by instinct, you shrink, you contract, you hold your breath, but it's no use. In almost every part of rural Europe, there was a rule that said during the night every citizen had to keep an external light lit at their door. Otherwise, you were fined for absence of civil illumination. Literally. You had to be seen to prove you existed and were an honest person. You stumbled toward a candle next to the fireplace, this spark of bottled fortune, and find a little tranquility. But the peace is short-lived. Your candle starts to flicker abruptly, as if the wind decided to play at sabotage. You cup the flame with your hand, but the tremor coming from inside, no one can stop that. You remember that even the wind was considered a spiritual messenger in certain rural beliefs, and that a candle going out could mean the displeasure of the gods, or just bad luck. Either way, a flickering candle was serious business. Trying to contain the tremor, you pick up the rest of the candle to light your pale face, and you notice a torn note nailed to the wood of your door. It says something like, "Whoever lives here must pay the tribute of silence." It's not just a joke. There were rural localities where, to maintain moral order, houses were required to maintain silence after the curfew, under penalty of a fine or moral counseling. Some considered nocturnal noise a sign of debauchery or an affront to the sacred peace. So, letting out the sound of a crooked laugh could condemn you. You sigh and turn back. Your heart is still racing. In the dark, the curfew is more etiquette than security, but nobody wants to test it. You wonder when normal life became an act of transgression. You walk back to your corner, light an oil lamp, a weak sign of civilization, and settle in with no confidence that this moment of light will last, because the lamp uses imported oil, expensive, and subject to heavy taxes. This was the era when even the right to see your own hand involved bureaucracy. You close your eyes without sleeping. This ritual has become a distraction. Tonight, the lamp flickers and goes out. But you still see, with your soul's eyes, the world conspiring against your simple will to exist. And then, before sleep takes you, a thought crosses your mind. If even breathing with luminous accompaniment requires authorization, imagining the future must be a capital crime. And with that improbable thought, you let yourself be enveloped by the darkness. But it's not a simple darkness. It's an authoritarian darkness, with internal regulations. The night deepens, but rest doesn't come. You're still lying on the straw, trying to ignore the pain in your hip and the smell of a burnt-out candle. Exhaustion is right there beside you, watching you, but sleep has decided to play hide-and-seek tonight. And in the middle of the near silence, a sound cuts the darkness. Dong. It's the bell again, the curfew. It doesn't just warn that it's late to be on the street. It screams that any decent citizen should be unconscious, at most, coughing softly between the blankets. This bell, mind you, isn't a cultural detail. It's a public sonic order, a collective alert that the outside world now belongs to the darkness, the rats, and the inspectors of silence. You know this, and even so, you lie motionless, listening to the echo of the bell slide down the walls of the village, and you think, what other era had the whim to mark the end of the day with a bell that imposes silence, as if the night were a contract? Slowly, everything around you fades. The weak lights of the houses go out, the voices disappear. All that's left is the creaking of windows being locked by hurried hands, because in your village, keeping any light source on after the bell can earn you an unwanted visit and a fine. Of course, even this is regulated. If the light is too strong, you're a suspect. If it's too weak, you're a vagrant. The right amount is the one nobody notices. In other words, you've already failed. You look at your own hesitant candle. It flickers, as if it knows it's there illegally. The flame makes shadows dance on the wall, and you try to imagine they're just illusions, not invisible inspectors from the clergy, measuring your soul by the clarity of the wax. And if the light wasn't enough, there's the sound. Yes, sound. Even noise in certain villages was grounds for punishment. After the bell, laughter was almost a confession of sin. Loud conversations, potential accusations. Playing a musical instrument at night, only if it was for mass. Otherwise, you were deliberately trying to invoke the wrong thing. Silence was a symbol of order, and making noise out of hours was almost the same as shouting, "I am the problem." But of course, that never stopped your neighbors. The family on the left is still muttering softly, as if nocturnal gossip isn't a sin. The one on the right is snoring loudly, which is probably also on some forgotten parish prohibition list. You get up carefully, opening just a sliver of the window, not wanting to attract attention. And there it is, the street, empty, damp, and with the kind of darkness that feels more like a threat than an absence of light. Except, in the middle of this domesticated gloom, you see a man walking alone. He's carrying a lantern. The flame is too strong, too clear, almost an affront. You don't recognize the face, but the walk is that of someone who thinks they're important. Maybe an official messenger. Maybe someone who paid for the license to walk illuminated, because yes, that existed in many places. Walking the street after the bell was only allowed with authorization and, of course, an approved lantern. Even the intensity of the light could be policed. And here you were, thinking the only problem was the lack of electricity. You watch the man until he disappears around the bend, and then you ask yourself, will there ever be a day in this life of bizarre laws and silent censorship when you can simply go out and walk with a candle? You close the window and go back to the straw. The smell of burning wax still stuck in your nose. The candle is almost at its end, like your patience. The sound of the bell is gone, but what's left is worse, the expectation. Because silence in the Middle Ages was never truly silent. It was just the pause before the next judgment. You turn on your side, the straw pricks, the floor groans, your body complains, and you just breathe, silently, hoping your breathing isn't interpreted as heresy, because in this village, even the air seems controlled by decree. The silence that fell the previous night was heavy, and by this point, you'd expect everything to be still. But a noise begins. It's not a bark. It's not a bell. It's the sound of regimented footsteps, of boots hitting the ground rhythmic as if it's an invitation or an order. You stretch. Trying not to make noise is a medieval art, and you realize you're not alone on your empty street. A watchman is passing, in light armor and with a bored expression. He carries a torch that sways. Every night, watchmen had a pattern to follow. Circulate, light torches, check doors, and let out a "all's well," loud and clear. Except, no. He could, but he plays the silent role. These watchmen weren't a fantasy invention. They were called the Watch, a ridiculous name but real. They were the ones who patrolled, reported anyone wandering the city without purpose, and pushed drunks back into their holes. You watch the solitary watchman go on his way, his fist secure on the torch handle, and you think, cool, street control that works, before remembering it was all a bit clumsy. Documents say many were old, lazy, or distracted. Imagine being an inspector of silence and falling asleep at your post. Well, it was normal. You're disappointed and look away. But then, like a little addendum to medieval law, you remember the Vagabonds Act. Appropriate, right? This law said that anyone without occupation or clear justification for being out, walking around, could be interrogated, fined, or even arrested for suspicious idleness. B, if you were inside your house reading a book, if you had one, it was fine. But if you were on the street, breathing the night air, you were a vagabond, and that was a problem. You worry. You look at the corner. You imagine a tribunal, a wooden gavel, and all the rest. Then you realize the watchman passed, and everything is okay for now. But you know that if a torch caught too much attention, too strong, or too weak, you could become a neighborhood case, even without meaning to. Thinking about this, you go to the door, a quick test of brightness. If you leave an invisible sliver lit, it's better. You end up putting it out. The darkness seems to spit a serves you right, because even not being seen could be synonymous with negligence. And negligence was an urban sin. After all, if you can't even keep a candle alive, how are you going to maintain your reputation? You take a deep breath. The distant murmur starts up again. A muffled shout, a horse's neigh. The sigh of the wind, controlled noises, because the curfew still hangs in the air like a regulated shadow. You head back and see people whispering at the city gate. It seems someone was released from the vagabond accusation because he claimed he was seeking inspiration for the Sunday sermon. Inspiration was an authorized excuse. Almost. The notion of creativity hid the fact that you had to have a defined purpose while wandering. You reach the straw, your official bed, and recline, already exhausted from trying to prove you have a reason to exist with every step. You close your eyes and remember the watchman, stumbling, and how everything seemed to regulate the shadows themselves. Even breathing could be regulated if it was meticulously observed. For a moment, the idea of sleeping seems laughable. You should be equipped with a guilt waiver or a purpose ticket. But then you realize that despite the surveillance, nobody called you, so you'll keep sleeping. Go to sleep, because despite everything, fulfilling your medieval routine of ordered absence was still easier than trying to dodge the laws that only existed to remind you that existing too much was a suspicion. And with that philosophical reflection of a survivor, you fall asleep, but with the fear that in your dream, you'll be accused of exploring sleep without a license. You awaken with a slight tremor. It's not cold. It's the realization of everything that has flown from your memory and landed with weight on your straw pillow. It's 15 blocks of laws that only make sense if you're playing chaos's advocate. But it's not a joke, it's real. And you survived. Today, you're still in that historical limbo, a suspicious spectator of your own coherent routine. The village is still there, full of laws torn on paper, applied by those with more authority than common sense. There are no intact swords left, no silent urban alleys, no neighbors who escape the gossip of the bell. Everything was regulated, the lanterns, the footsteps, even the air you breathe. You take a step, you chew a crumb of bread left over from the edible legal miscellany. You look at the sky. It's only visible because the clouds have parted. But if it were overcast, it could be a divine rebuke for excess of rational thought. Literally, thinking could be considered a subversive crime, especially if it was modern thought. You decide to walk slowly because medieval fatigue is superior, even to the entrance of the village. There they are, the symbols of authority, the silent bell, the crooked sign of laws, and the gazes, still searching for suspects. You wonder if you'd be welcome, surprised you're just one more invisible person. Maybe that is the most efficient law of all. To disappear is the best way to obey. All that survived this rigid medieval system was the lesson that freedom was as rare as eating cheese without an accent or breathing without permission. And you, my friend, are here, stepping between norms, breathing between decrees. It's the great paradox of medieval existence. To live by decree was to survive against it, and somehow you became a master at it. And now, tired listener, we've reached the end of this journey through 40 laws that would get you arrested just for existing too much. You've migrated through absurdity, disguised smiles, and normative subsistence. Good night, tired listener. And until the next one, sleep with a tired story.